Since the conception of private property, squatting has existed. It can be land squatting, occupying an abandoned building, or even squatting on a boat. In the last half-century, squatting has become a political movement. In the 70s, activist collectives would break into abandoned buildings and establish community centers. They weren't pretty, and inevitably, the state would send the police to forcibly evict them. Despite this, squatters continue to do so as a form of protest and direct action. The history of squatting as a form of activism is simply too much to discuss. From the original 60s activists to the philosophy of Crass, there's a lot of factors that led to punks forming squats. For a small example, a focus on New York City. The Lower East Side, specifically the East Village and Alphabet City, located between Avenues A through D, have hosted many squats. Young activists and punks would break into these abandoned buildings and live there. Large sections of abandoned rubble were cleared away and turned into community gardens. In the 90s, Mayor Rudy Giuliani practically waged a war to kick out the squatters and bulldoze those gardens. A temporary restraining order was issued against the city, which saved the few remaining gardens. To this day, the Lower East Side is home to over a dozen such gardens, all cared for by the community. New York City's Alphabet City is home to the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Space, located in C-Squat. C-Squat, along with the ABC No Rio, are part of a handful of survivors in the city. However, across the Atlantic, squatting is still very much an ongoing fight. While New York was a losing battle in the 2000s, two women would go all the way to Europe and try to etch out a life squatting. This video follows the stories of squatters and travelers through the books Off the Map and Railroad Man. I'll also briefly talk about two movies that failed to convey those realities. Off the Map. Off the Map was first published by the Crime Think Letters series. It started off as a series of well-worn zines that were passed around so much that they were falling apart. Eventually, the letters were compiled into a book. The authors, Hibikina and Kika, remain pseudo-anonymous. The book has been in print ever since and is practically a staple of anarcho-punks across the US. Because the book is in the public domain, almost every leftist publisher sells a copy. So what makes Off the Map such a staple? I think the answer is that the book contrasts the bleak misery of squatting with an unbridled optimism for a better way to live. It's well-written, thoughtful, and vehemently optimistic. Off the Map does not sugarcoat the awfulness of what the writers went through, but it shows you how they turned what would have otherwise been pure misery into hope for a better tomorrow. I'd be doing you a disservice by recounting the events of the book in detail. The whole point is to experience it through the eyes of the travelers. But I will quote a few passages here and there. To give a brief overview, the authors, Hib and Kika, have set off to travel across Europe with no money, heading towards Spain. They attempt to find a place to live in Barcelona, only to become disillusioned with the city. From there, they journey north again across Europe. Due to the fact these are letters and journal entries, there are many large time skips. One chapter could be in Barcelona, and the next could be in France with no details as to what transpired between departing Spain and arriving in France. It keeps the book from becoming too narratively focused, but it paints a confusing picture at times. For example, in the beginning of the book, Hib and Kika talk about spitting fire for tourists as a trick to earn cash, but it's never mentioned again. Off the Map offers not only vignettes into the lives of the authors, but also the many people they encounter. While there are no outright horrible encounters put to paper, they do meet many unhelpful or passive-aggressive people on their journey. Often the worst encounters are only alluded to. The greatest hurdles they faced in this book are the indifference of strangers. There is one recurring motif throughout their journey. Most of the squats they encounter are shadows of what they could have been. Many times Hib and Kika go to a squat with a great reputation for being forward-thinking collective, only for it to barely have anyone inhabiting it. There's also a stark gender divide present in the book. All the squats are run by young men who don't seem very pleased to have two women crashing with them. At one point, Kika refers to one squat as an apathetic boys' clubhouse with soft porn on the walls. Another good moment comes when the authors are offered a place to stay and courteously decline, only to realize the sincerity of the offer. In the United States, especially on the West Coast, most people are disingenuous. Often offers of help are just words and never intended to be taken up on. In the United States, the phrase, "a friend in need is a friend indeed," is meant to be said sardonically while rolling your eyes. In this moment in the book, it's a window into the toxic politeness that poisons American culture and unlearning that abroad. Throughout the journey across Europe, we get glimpses into the lives of the people that Hib and Kika meet. A melancholy moment comes towards the end of the book, hitching a ride with a truck driver. The authors are torn between their need to keep themselves safe by distrusting strangers on the road, and the politeness and loneliness of the driver. The man offers them tea and scones and remarks that he wished he had the time to have a family, but that taking care of the authors was almost like having daughters for a bit. Perhaps most importantly, after 20 years of publication, Off the Map is a window into the past, a time before smartphones, GPS, social media, or even common access to the internet. It's a moment of time when traveling was done by maps, by asking people in person, and by guesswork and happenstance. A cross-continental trip from the Netherlands to Spain to the Czech Republic. It's also a glimpse into the culture of early 2000s Europe, just shortly after 9/11. To see the attitudes Europeans held towards Americans abroad, many are welcoming despite critiquing the war and the Bush regime. One quote I'd like to share is at one of Hib and Kika's lowest points, which is a challenge as they face many in this trip. Quote, "You might need time to nurse the wounds of your dreams. This is not what you expected, but anything you are ready to love is lovable, even if it's scarred or fucked up or broken. These are still good and worthy dreams." End quote. Off the Map isn't merely a recollection of hitchhiking stories across Europe. It's militant optimism and desire to set the example of kindness, even in the most awful moments of life, are a manifesto in and of itself. Some lifelong crust punks I've met openly dismiss the book. One such person told me of living in the New York City subway, quote, "If you don't feed the rats, they'll feed on you," end quote. A gruesome reality for which no amount of rosy words can paint over. Speaking only for myself, I wish back when I was homeless that someone would have given me a copy of this book. I think the kind of optimism would have given me the courage to say yes more often. The times I've spent on the street were brief, perhaps too brief for my opinion to really count, but it was made worse by my inability to open myself up to people, to seek help or accept new ways of living or to have a new vision for myself and of myself. When I was homeless, I was my own worst enemy, and I think this book could have changed that. The realities of crust punks in the US. The anarchist punks of Europe and South America are a completely different culture, have different values, and sometimes more consistent politics than their US counterparts. In the United States, the life of a crust punk is utterly miserable affair. Sometimes called dirty kids or oogles, it's one that gets bogged down in substance abuse, domestic violence, mental health issues, and innumerable run-ins with the law. It's not to put crusties down or to say they don't align with Off the Map, but the harsh reality of being homeless in the US can't be ignored. A good counterpoint to Off the Map is Railroad Man, The Legend of Little Jay, by Tina Ward and Jacqueline Suey. The book is about the life of Jay Litzner, known to his friends and loved ones as Little Jay, who died while riding a train from Seattle to San Francisco. The book is composed of accounts of his life from those who knew him, as told from the perspective of his surviving partner. It shows the brutal and unforgiving reality of being a crust punk in the US. Yet, much like Off the Map, Jay himself was a man of boundless optimism and passion for activism. The book takes us through the last years of Jay's life. It chronicles his struggles with addiction, recovering emotionally from incarceration and probation, and the crushing poverty of the crust punk life. It also shows the highs and freedom that life had, from joining protests ad hoc, to rainbow gatherings, to train hopping. Jay's life was fascinating. He made friends wherever he went. Much like an Off the Map, no matter how brutal life got for him, Jay remained optimistic and devoted to a new way of life outside the confines of society. A good example of the highs and lows being that while freezing in Portland, Jay and his fiancée Rosie plan on starting an anarchist music festival. After surviving an overdose and escaping the hell that is Portland, Oregon, Jay managed to successfully organize and kick off A-Fest a few months later. Tragically, Jay Litzner died during a train hopping accident. He had been forced to ride on an intermodal car, which doesn't have a floor. These types of rail cars are almost bottomless, with steel buttresses comprising the lower half. They are called suicide cars, and riding in them is called riding suicide. Sadly for Jay Litzner, despite all of his past train hopping experience, the odds went out against him. The book ends with a plea from a former rail yard manager begging readers not to ride the rails. I don't feel it would be right for me to impose my own personal opinions on the late Little Jay. This book was written primarily for his family, friends, acquaintances, and the greater community. It'd be wrong of me to critique the events in this book or the choices Jay made. I do recommend giving this book a read if you want to see firsthand what a life riding the rails is like. However, I do want to share my own personal experience and reasons why I never train hopped. Train hopping is dangerous, deadly, and illegal. The problem isn't merely danger, but also social media cloud chasers have made it more dangerous by publicizing it, by glamorizing it, and by making it harder to find trustworthy guides and mentors to help greenhorns ride safely. I've met veteran train hoppers who warn me not to ride, not just because of the physical danger, but the legal danger. Squatting in the movies. Two films I watched that were relevant to the American side of things were Hunting Pignut by Martin Blue and Gutterbug by Andrew Gibson. Hunting Picnic takes place in Nova Scotia. The film is a bleak look at squats and the miserable side of being a crusty. It's the director's first feature-length film, and it very much shows. It is depressingly accurate on the terrible side of living in a squat, but it does gloss over whatever positives can come from building a community, even if the community is a shit one dominated by addiction and mental illness. It's a very bleak film that's already made up its mind to look down on crust punks and squats, but relents last second in the very end, giving it a tonal whiplash. I can't recommend the movie as it's very rough and inconsistent, but it does have its moments. By contrast, Gutterbug is way too art house and auteur in tone. It feels like a collage of better punk movies, watered down and with thinner character. Within the first 10 minutes, we get a ref to 1986's Sid and Nancy, directed by Alex Cox. The film is meandering, navel-gazing, and just miserable to sit through. It's filled with a lot of what I would call film student characters. Quirky people in situations that seem fun on paper, but are one-dimensional and annoying in execution. Gutterbug also, and this is the most crucial part, completely misses the train hopping and squatting parts of the crustpunk lifestyle. Okay, so there's this last second thing that I have to add, which is I had to stop watching Gutterbug halfway through. There's this one scene where his mom's baking the cake. Oh, I'm sure he'll come home any day now. He's gonna be home. My sonny will be home for his birthday. And I just was done. I just couldn't handle it anymore. It was just too fucking much. He's getting a birthday cake. Oh, I'm sure son will come in through the door any second now. I sure do miss my son. And then the fucking dad's like, oh, how dare you bake a cake? It's just Jesus Christ. It's a glaring oversight that makes an already derivative film even more unwatchable. It's also incredibly fucking boring. It's just an outright miserable, pretentious movie to watch. Seriously, fuck Gutterbug. And both these films forget about politics completely. A recurring issue in the media is portraying crust punks as apolitical, which could not be further from the truth. Granted, there's always some annoying guy called Cowboy or something stupid like that, who will flaunt their indifference, that one edgelord who needs everyone to know how little they care. But the vast majority of crust punks are anarchists, and do show up to protests. For example, I interviewed a few at Occupy Wall Street, link in the description for that video. Travel Guide. There are many travel guides, but if you're in the US, I recommend The Anarchist's Guide to Travel by Matthew Derrick. It's a self-published book with advice from the author based upon all of his years of traveling. Matthew Derrick is the admin of Squat the Planet, a forum dedicated to hitchhikers, crust punks, hobos, and train hoppers, and no, they will not tell you how to hop a train by just joining the first day. Conclusion. There's a reason Off the Map has stayed a leftist staple over the last 20 years. I think the American left can learn a lot from this unscathed optimism. Phrases like, a better world is in your heart, sound trite. Cynicism is at an all-time high, and twee insincere sweetness under the guise of wholesome is not a rebuttal to it. There's a conflation between vulnerability and weaponized oversensitivity. Being vulnerable isn't sealing yourself away in an echo chamber and woke scolding anyone who reminds you of the real world. It's taking risks out there where the falls are real and hurt. I am very tired of people hiding behind irony to protect themselves from a culture of pure interpersonal cynicism. The social media world of wholesomeness and tenderness and endless unnecessary content warnings are the opposite of being vulnerable and sincere. These are the trappings of withdrawing from society. It's the philosophy of, don't tell me bad things. It's the farthest thing from bringing optimism into the world. We can't make a better world if we refuse to even engage with it. Off the Map shows us that while the world is cruel, people can overcome it with help from each other. All too often I see American leftists throw each other to the wolves. I see people let each other down to protect their own skin, or to maintain the status quo, or not to rock the boat. Maybe it's time to take risks to make that better world we dream of. Talk is cheap. The world is never going to be safe, but we can bring kindness into it. It's risky. It puts us in danger. But if we want a better world, it's better to get hurt in the process than not start the process at all. A better, kinder world means taking the blows. It means standing out in the rain, freezing. It means abandoning safety and taking risks on other people, even knowing that they can, and at some point will, hurt you. But life is worth the risk.
You spare me some change? That's weird. It's just like, oh! And like when they just ignore me, it hurts my feelings. It hurts my feelings when they ignore me because I'm still hungry and they just ignore me.